to welcome this evening Dr. Joanna McIntyre, who is going to lead the seminar this evening. Her title is Making Space for Refugee Education, Routes Towards Meaningful Inclusion for Refugee Teenagers in England. And Jo is going to talk about something that is, at the heart of her research. She's, over the past few years, developed an international reputation for her work in refugee education, and particularly looking at the way that schools deal with the barriers particularly, but also the opportunities that they're faced when working to support refugee children. She's worked internationally, and particularly with colleagues in Sweden at Lund University, and has just recently published this book, which I highly recommend. Jo is no stranger to the Department of Education here at Oxford. She's an honorary research fellow at the department and is also works with us on the PGC program for where she's an external examiner. I think this is going to be a sort of fascinating seminar, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what Jo's got to say. So over to you, Jo.
Thank you very much, Trevor. Thank you for the invitation to speak today, and also for that very nice series of words. I'm going to be sharing some of the thinking behind the book that Trevor's just waved at you, that was published earlier this year with my colleague Fran Abrams. And when I was writing the concluding sections of the book, we were just in the beginnings of the pandemic, which had seen social and material inequalities particularly magnified. And inevitably, refugee and asylum-seeking children have seen the effects of this. In the concluding chapter and today, I call for a more socially just, inclusive model for all, as we reconceptualize society in a post-pandemic world. We've all experienced how in different ways our lives have taken extraordinary turns from our norms. And I'll be drawing on two theoretical frames, one of which is Ravi Kohli's Resumption of Ordinary Life, which seems very timely given that today, for so many in England, we're marking a return to some form of normality in many aspects of our life as our society begins to reopen. And so for many of us, we've been longing for a return to some sense of ordinariness after such a long period of extraordinariness. Perhaps because of this, there'll be a greater empathy for young refugee children who, as Ravi Kohli observes, at the point of becoming forced migrants and refugees, stopped experiencing an everyday existence. From that point, the journey towards a place of safety and a place to call home, where they can resume an ordinary life again, begins for children like Amina, who was 13 when she wrote this prize-winning poem, A Lament for Syria. This is an extract from her poem, which is published in an edited book of poems from brilliant young people like Amina, based at Oxford Spires School. My interpretation of the first part of the poem that's on the screen is that this stanza is about her memories of ordinary life in Syria, and that she's struggling to resume this sense of ordinariness and hence find a homeland in her new place. In the book, we examined the ways in which schools can facilitate that resumption of ordinariness for children with recent experiences of forced migration. I was fortunate enough to listen to Sarah Dryden-Peterson talk at an earlier Oxford public seminar this year, as she described the role that refugee education plays in helping young people engaged in future building amidst uncertain futures. She described teachers' unique roles in shaping pathways towards more certain futures, and this really resonated with my work, which focuses on education spaces and the ways in which teachers within them can and do shape inclusive education for refugee children in classrooms today, located many miles away from their homes. So the local context for the research evidence in the book is England, but the work has been shaped by a sustained collaboration with Swedish educators, and the evidence and arguments speak to other international resettlement contexts. Refugee education operates at global, national and local levels. And although there are international agreements about the ways in which nation states should provide high quality inclusive education and opportunities for lifelong learning, education systems are experienced very differently at the local level by refugee children who have resettled in different countries. And studies indicate that enactment of these global commitments are dependent upon how an individual nation state interprets their responsibilities towards these international declarations and treaties. Sarah Dryden-Peterson and her colleagues outline a typology of models of refugee education, which relates to the possible futures governments imagine for refugees and their likely length of stay. And according to this typology, high-income countries such as England are resettlement contexts, as refugee children are likely to view their futures with a sense of permanency in the country. In February 2018, a news article reporting our work was published in the English newspaper The Guardian. The article focused on the experiences of Noor and Amar, unaccompanied asylum seekers arriving in Sweden and England respectively at the ages of 16. The news story, which contrasted the ways in which Sweden and England responded to the needs of young asylum seekers arriving in their communities, provided a useful summary of the effects of contrasting policies on the reception of new arrivals in each context. In Sweden, Noor was given swift access to education and supported to develop his existing skills in textiles and design subjects. He says, "When I started school, it became better and better for me." In England, by contrast, Amar struggled to gain access to appropriate education provision that would meet his needs to resume an academic education to fulfill his ambition of becoming a doctor. He said, "Education is really important to me. I was just bored and frustrated waiting." However, whilst the news article reported our initial comparisons of policy landscapes and suggested that Noor was better served than Amar, it also illustrated important issues that the empirical work raised about inclusive classroom practices for newly arrived pupils in each context, and what practitioners in each context could learn from each other. And since the publication of the article, our projects evolved to develop a conceptual model drawn from empirical data and close work with practitioners in both contexts. I bring two theories together, which both have utility for considering a future-focused approach to refugee education. In the first, Kohli argues that the reality for many children who have left their homes because of forced migration is that their search for an ordinary existence still continues, despite reaching their resettlement context. He conceptualizes their experiences as transitions through safety, belonging, and success, as the children move within and across spatial, temporal, and natural dimensions of change. While Kohli was working within the field of social work, and you can see education just appears in the success circle there, we bring his theory of resumption of ordinary life to our work in education, and to establish a normative operational basis for judging policies and practices for refugee education. FRASER'S theory of participatory parity is based on the premise that social conditions need to be achieved such that all members of society can participate and interact with one another as peers. This theory of social justice and its three components of redistribution, recognition, and representation are lenses through which to identify barriers to equitable access and inclusion for refugee children in education. FRASER therefore establishes a normative moral basis against which policies and practices can be measured. So the work explores the utility of Kohli's model in conjunction with FRASER'S model for educational practitioners. And the theoretical understandings offered today and in the book have been developed with those practitioners. As I've said, the research draws on an ongoing project which compares the experiences of educational practitioners supporting upper secondary aged refugees resettling in England and Sweden. Phase 1 was a comparison of policy documentation, which observed an absence of policy for refugee and education in England, with no updated policy documents since the coalition government in 2010, and which markedly contrasts with Sweden, where there's an abundance of policy. And at the same time, and again in contrast to Sweden, in England, there's no easy way of tracking data about the numbers of refugee children in English schools. So we describe this as a contrast of visible and invisibility in policy terms. And so to refer back to my title for this talk, I would argue this is an area where we should do better and make space for policies on refugee education. For phase 2, a key component of the research design was the dialogues between practitioners and school leaders in different institutions within each country and then also across the countries. At its simplest level, we spent time in focus groups with the leaders and teachers and asked them about the two theoretical frames and how this resonated with what their daily practice was. The school leaders and the research teams visited each other's schools in each country, and this was followed by virtual focus groups, bringing together them to talk about what they'd learned and how this developed their understanding of the concepts. Phase 3 followed this, and the fieldwork was then extended in England to include 5 good practice schools. And when I say good practice, this wasn't my definition or Ofsted's definition. This was by people working on the ground to support refugees, so local charities who would say that's a good school. If we can get our refugee children to that school, they'll do really well there. And those were the case study schools in 3 English cities that form the basis for the book. In this work, it became apparent that the practitioners honed in on Kohli's concepts, and they defined and further refined those concepts of safety, belonging, and success through their prolonged discussions. And they came together to utilise the operational model to make sense of what they did and could do better. However, FRASER'S framing came into its own when they tried to identify the enabling factors and barriers to enacting safety, belonging and success in their schools. In the book, I present an account of how each concept is defined through chapters which begin with a pen portrait of a case study school exemplifying a particular concept, and then a section in each chapter called Debates and Dialogues, which reports the ongoing conversations as we develop shared understandings, and the chapters end with a summary of the definitions of each of the concepts. I'll try and showcase some of this in what follows. Kohli articulates how school contributes to establishing routines so that newly arrived children begin to feel safe in the day-to-day by finding predictable patterns, shapes and rhythms of living. And we were interested to continually unpick what the concept of safety resonated with our practitioners. They shared stories of how young new arrivals have experienced a lack of safety outside of school, either because of their insecure status and were constantly waiting to hear if they could stay in the country, or because of risks they'd encountered on their journeys. But they also spoke of how some students like Amir and Victor needed specific reassurance and support as they adjusted to the new environment. In these circumstances, the schools felt it was their responsibility to ensure that the students felt physically and psychologically safe within school. This was partly achieved by considering the spatial aspects of creating a safe environment, and they talked to the ways in which language bases or reception classes for new arrivals functioned as safe spaces within schools, spaces where new arrivals could begin to make relationships with peers facing similar challenges, learn the new language, and learn about the rules and expectations of classrooms in their new environment. These spaces were transitional spaces to support the new arrivals in bridging relationships across the wider school. After periods of uncertainty, schools are places which represent continuity and where hope can be restored, contributing to psychological aspects of safety for refugee children. And the practitioners felt it was important that children had experiences that built trust and acknowledged risk-taking, recognizing that some children had and were continuing to experience trauma. And one said, we try to create an environment where it's okay, I guess, to be yourself, but to kind of be vulnerable as well. We kind of try to make it okay to be struggling. They shared ways of working with external agencies and counsellors to support them, but they also wanted to challenge the view that refugee children should automatically be regarded as needy and victims. They sought ways to help them to develop a sense of agency, recognising that some of the unaccompanied young people had acted independently for the majority of their migration journeys. And the practitioners spoke about the ways in which the homogenising labels refugee, new arrival, mask the individual's experiences and needs. There's a temporal aspect to the concept of safety too. The practitioners shared concerns about how to manage the expectations many new arrivals have of how education can help them to resume not just an ordinary life, but in many cases ambitions for an extraordinary life. They spoke of the guilt that unaccompanied asylum seekers have in being the chosen one, and the need to prove that the family's sacrifice was worth it. But how to support ambitions within a restricted time frame of opportunity and formalised education was a discussion revisited many times in the focus groups. But it was incumbent on those working with the newly arrived to provide clarity about what could be achieved in the short term in the educational setting, but also to extend this by being very transparent about what the next possible steps could be. This seemed to provide some sense of security for those who were anxious that time had been wasted on the journey and then in waiting for a school place, and then in trying to achieve the qualifications for their career ambitions. Having confidence in a future after experiencing instability in the past and present was considered to be a very important aspect of making the young person feel a sense of safety. Key to this was that the search for safety is a continuous process. The teachers commented it was very hard for children to feel a prolonged sense of security when they could only live in the moment. So as Fatima says, I don't know what's going to happen today, but today I am happy. So the definition that they arrived at was that safety is a concept that has particular resonance in refugee education. It's a multifaceted concept, physical, emotional, psychological, which permeates life in and out of educational settings. Schools can support a sense of safety by creating safe spaces and environments for trust building through experiential learning, providing explicit opportunities for social and emotional learning and risk-taking, being consistent about and explicit about expectations, and being flexible about curriculum access, but having high aspirations for new arrivals. How can schools and colleagues begin to support a sense of belonging and affinity for individuals whose personal landscapes of belonging have been altered as they have left behind places, people and communities that they've known so well? The Swedes, when visiting English schools, noticed newly arrived children displaying visible markers of belonging to a common school community through uniforms, badges, house affiliations, and in positive indicators of diversity in public displays. They commented that it seems easier to see what is typical in the English context than in Sweden, where newcomers have to decode so much because there are fewer visible affiliation markers. Beyond visual markers, the practitioners described ongoing practices and strategies for engendering a sense of social belonging, geared around students' positive relationships with their own self, with their new peers, with school communities, and with the wider communities beyond. As they shared their experiences, the dialogues and debates centred on the role of culturally relevant pedagogies, especially if the new arrivals' prior experience had been very different to the new context. In addition, they spoke of the importance of recognising if the new arrival had a faith, the development of language skills, and the commitment to valuing multilingualism, and a holistic asset-based assessment of the child's prior experiences and existing knowledges and skills. Finding opportunities for new arrivals to show what they can do in an environment where so much is challenging was seen as an important aspect of developing self-esteem and well-being. Whilst this asset-based approach develops self-belief, the practitioners felt it also helps the young person to engage with their peers in the school, especially in arts, sports, and practical subjects. But despite all these strategies, it's clear that older new arrivals still struggle to develop meaningful friendships with peers in their new context, and that practitioners are acutely aware of this and feel a responsibility to try and help. As well as finding ways of engendering a sense of connectedness within school or college, the practitioners also invested in activities designed to encourage connections to and belonging within local communities and the wider society. This was achieved in various ways, through trips, activities, and so on. And this place-based pedagogical approach was supported by senior leaders in schools who often found ways to publicly celebrate activities that allowed the refugees to be able to contribute to a community in which they're still finding their feet. The boat that you can see there, A up me duck, is a local slang expression in the community that these refugee children were beginning to become familiar with, and they wanted to appropriate that language. In preparing children for these activities, the practitioners spoke about their sense of responsibility for making sure that new arrivals understood the ways of being and conventions of their new society. They felt it was incumbent on them to help break down potential misunderstandings. They knew how much the young people wanted to feel accepted. However, the practitioners were also committed to demonstrating that belonging was dialogic, a two-way process for both the individual and the school. They were oriented towards inclusion, knowing that school communities with new arrivals become more tolerant and diverse, with greater connectedness to the wider world as a result. The practitioners' debates about their practice show how belongingness can be created, and they observed that schools have a particular role to play in this. However, it wasn't always straightforward to create spaces in schools and colleges to develop belonging for refugee pupils. And in trying to understand what the barriers were, we utilised FRASER'S theory with the practitioners as a moral framing to interrogate inequalities and help identify the sources of these inequalities through the lenses of redistribution, of recognition and representation. So there's insufficient time now to illustrate each of the components, safety, belonging and success, in relation to the moral frame. So I'm just going to focus on how the practitioners and I drew on FRASER'S participatory parity to understand any barriers to realising a sense of the concept of belonging. So for FRASER, if the barrier is economic, the solution lies in the redistribution of human and material resources. For our purposes, this would be about how people, place and time and material resources are organised in school provision for new arrivals. With regard to belonging, there's a need for opportunities for engagement with a range of activities that engender social relations and connection with place. And these are activities which need financial resource and staff time. Some will take place outside of school space and outside of the school day, and so require staffing flexibility. They don't necessarily lead to immediate visible gains, and therefore leadership needs to have a long-term commitment to an enrichment ethos. In schools where this is already the case, then the resourcing implications are lessened. Secondly, recognition of cultural, linguistic and socio-ecological experiences are imperative to new arrivals' well-being and participation in society. The role of first language dominated much of the discussion in England. Dominant practices seem to encourage the child to become monolingual in English, and the practitioners felt this was short-sighted and an example of misrecognition within policy. Pressures to perform in national and international comparisons of educational outcomes privilege particular knowledges and pedagogies which often do not accord with refugee students' prior experiences. Despite the lack of policy guidance in recent times, a number of practitioners in key strategic roles supporting new arrivals had been working in schools with diverse populations for some time, and these practitioners could draw on policy memory of multiculturalism and culturally relevant pedagogies to help shape their recognition of what was needed to foster an inclusive environment to help new arrivals develop a sense of belonging. There were concerns that in areas where schools had less experience, then this might be more difficult. Throughout, the practitioners focused on what they needed to do and on the cultural barriers preventing new arrivals from achieving parity of participation in the present and in their future. They focused on strategies to develop relationships, self-esteem and a sense of social connectedness through recognition of assets and skills that young refugees bring. By facilitating opportunities for working with peers in school and with people from the wider community, the new arrival and the new society are encouraged to think critically about themselves and the broader social world. And such an approach foregrounds high expectations and recognises there are ways in which we can help new arrivals to achieve and maximise their future capacity. But in order to fully achieve participatory parity, new arrivals need to be properly represented in policy and data. Children are more likely to feel they can belong if they feel they're represented through meaningful opportunities for truly representative student voice, and by seeing themselves represented by those who work within educational settings. Most schools in Europe are overwhelmingly populated by white middle-class teachers, and this is the case in England. Moves to increase the diversity of the teaching population are hindered by problems with teacher shortages and also by bureaucratic and technical barriers to recognising previous teaching experience and qualifications outside the UK. So this slide sums up the agreed definition of belonging, which, as you can see, we view as a dialogic process. And it's a definition which has been shaped by practice and which in turn has influenced practice and to some extent localised school policy, as the teachers and school leaders involved in the work made adjustments to their own practices in schools. To move on to success, for the practitioners, success meant much more than academic success. It was about instilling a sense of pride and celebration for the young people to experience succeeding in different ways on a daily basis. This was particularly important when young people felt frustrated by not being able to accelerate towards ambitions which required specific goalposts to be met and which seemed unobtainable, such as specific exam qualifications. In our English system, age demarcates endpoints in schooling, and so teachers had to be explicit about what could be achieved in the here and now, and how that was a route to next steps, and how the young people could have some agency when choosing this next step. They spoke of deliberately creating opportunities for new arrivals to experience a range of activities in which they could be successful and which could be celebrated. These usually took the form of celebrations of enrichment activities, sports, arts, or creative performances. Another key area where young people can experience success is in feeling part of a communal social activity, so the practitioners sought ways of engaging meaningfully with groups in the community. Activities of this type showed the young people that what they were doing was valued by members of their new context, and indicated, as one English practitioner observed, that these young people can fly and be fully contributing members of society. So success can be experienced by the young people in different ways, and for some young refugees, this means to become a doctor or an engineer. For others, it means the freedom to live what one child referred to as a simple life. Success through the lens of education takes many forms and is not restricted to the dominant discourse of academic performance. Succeeding is predicated upon feeling authentic, knowing how to make meaningful choices about next steps, and feeling valued. Refugee children should be given opportunities to experience successes in order to develop confidence, self-esteem and well-being, and ultimately agency and a sense of autonomy. Newly arrived children need to learn the rules of the dominant narratives of success in order to understand how their route might need to be different. They need to learn to conceptualize success in a variety of forms and to eventually feel that they're able to live lives of value and meaning. So the teachers see the model not as an abstraction, but as a practical tool to be used in planning and operationalising the ethics of inclusive education. First, Kohli's concepts of safety, belonging and success speak to practitioners and school leaders. But once they accept these as defining terms to an inclusive model, they then begin to question barriers to enacting these fully. And this is where the moral frame and FRASER'S tripartite comes in. The study demonstrates that both conceptual frames help practitioners to consider their everyday practices and to reshape them accordingly. The questioning of the barriers to operationalising aspects of Kohli's model illustrates the need to explore and interrogate normative moral framing of their work. So FRASER'S theory of participatory parity helps in doing this and illustrates there's a crucial interdependence between the two theoretical frames. In contexts which prioritise performativity, it becomes clear there's a need for brave leadership to champion new arrivals in order to promote their experiences of safety, belonging, and ultimately long-term success on a par with others in society. A brief interlude while I introduce SEBHAT to you. SEBHAT was a 17-year-old Eritrean when I met him, who'd been waiting 10 months for a school or college place. And he had said he had nothing else to do all week and so stayed in his room in semi-independent accommodation. He had trouble sleeping and suffered with recurring headaches and was later diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, linked to the experiences he had encountered on his solo journey across Libya before reaching Europe. When SEBHAT felt he could leave his room, he went to church and he went to a local refugee charities youth group's weekly meeting and to the local library where he tried to work on his understanding of the English alphabet. He also, for 8 weeks, took part in an arts project one afternoon a week. and this is him there. Eventually, he was offered 7 hours a week at college. He was finding it difficult to make connections with the others in the shared house who were much older than him. He said he was feeling lonely and spent much of his time isolated. He was hopeful that he'd be able to access more hours at college in the next academic year. However, in the following months, he ran away to London to try and find 2 other Eritrean boys he'd befriended whilst in the jungle in Calais. In effect, he made himself homeless and extremely vulnerable until a charity in London took care of him and found him a place of safety. SEBHAT'S experiences reflect national concerns about both social isolation and a lack of appropriately funded education provision for new arrivals who are post-16 when they arrive, a particularly vulnerable group of young people, especially those with no family support or network. I'd met SEBHAT a few times and maintained contact with him once he moved to London. He and others like him became the focus of conversations with people in the local authority who wanted to find a better way forward for others like him. So now I want to briefly turn to a specific space or place that was created to cater for young people arriving after the age of 16, what I've called Fern College in the book. The illustrations on all of the previous slides have been of young people at Fern College, engaged in various placemaking activities. The current picture shows a cooking class going on at Fern. Outside, it was the first snow of the year, and for some pupils, the first snow of their lives, but they save experiencing the snow until their cooking lesson's finished. Fern is a unique full-time post-16 provision for asylum-seeking and refugee young people, funded by a 2-year government controlling migration fund, aimed at supporting positive outcomes for unaccompanied asylum seekers. The manager of the provision had been involved in the Swedish England project and was aware of the theoretical framings I've just discussed with you. She shared my concerns about the opportunities available in the city to SEBHAT and others like him. She was able to develop the provision to ensure that as far as possible, there'd be a fair distribution of resource, that the provision would recognise and be responsive to the specific needs and assets of the young people, and that as far as possible would be steered by representative voices from the refugee community or from those who worked closely with them. There was also an understanding that there would be a need to design programmes that would allow young people to join at any point in the academic year, a challenge for most traditional educational settings. In these ways, the provision was established to offset the barriers that prevent marginalised groups from participating on a par with others in order to offer an inclusive educational experience. The full-time holistic provision offered a curriculum for building safety, belonging and succeeding, with an academic programme enhanced by planned activities designed to foster relational, cultural and social learning. What emerged was a commitment to placemaking activities which took the young people to different community groups and helped them to feel a part of their new city. Support for mental health was built in from the inception, with each child being assigned a key worker teacher who checked in with them each day and with weekly opportunities to meet with a counsellor. An advisory board comprising expertise from the fields of education, children's mental health, refugee law and social care was established. Prince Harry visited the provision and they wrote a welcome poem for him. By March 2020, the indicators were that the provision was more than a success in terms of educational outcomes and also, and importantly, in terms of other indicators of well-being. The 2-year funding was coming to an end and the advisory board was actively seeking funding streams to allow the provision to continue. And then lockdown happened. The young people were told they couldn't attend Fern each day and they returned to their different accommodations dispersed across the city. Like other education providers, the staff immediately set out to move their provision online. They were very worried about the mental health and impact of enforced physical isolation on some of the students. It's become very clear during the lockdown period that ordinary life had changed for these young people who had become used to daily contact with peers with similar experiences and teachers who were interested in how they were doing both in and out of the educational setting. Social justice is felt most keenly when participatory parity is dependent upon material and human resources that marginalised groups have limited access to. The advisory group and the teachers set out to sourcing laptops, as most children had only got a mobile phone with them. Eventually, every child had access to a laptop, and the teachers began working with them virtually, but they continued to deliver a physical pack of work for those with no internet access. Some sense of normalcy resumed, at least as far as the academic curriculum, but there was clearly a felt need to work more holistically with the young people. As with all crises, the teachers found creative solutions to ensure that safety, belonging and succeeding resumed for these young people. They phoned them individually every week, and they established a WhatsApp group which gradually saw the young people interacting with it more readily as they overcame their shyness. The teachers celebrated birthdays on the app and the young people followed suit. They posted pictures of meals they had cooked and the young people followed suit. They celebrated Eid and other festivals and posted pictures on the WhatsApp group and the young people followed suit. They also made videos of themselves with personalised messages to the group, encouraging them to stay positive and promising that they'd be together again soon. And some of the children made those videos too. I've actually got one, but I'm hesitant to share it with you because it's got a High School Musical theme tune to it, which might not be quite the tone of this talk. One of the things that triggered most responses from the young people was when the teachers started posting photographs from activities that the young people had been involved in as part of the non-academic provision, with reminders of funny recollections of how these activities had made them come together. The cooking, climbing, trips to different places, pottery, music, drama, dance, and so on, and the garden they'd been creating. These memories clearly had real resonance with individuals within the group, with one post generating over 100 comments. They also tried to connect with communities beyond Fern during this online space. And here they managed to access a women's online arts group for the girls in the group. But they felt that this was something they weren't doing well. However, the holistic ambition of safety, belonging and succeeding was somehow continuing through the creative approaches they were taking. So as we're approaching gradual liftings of lockdown and social distancing and of a resumption of a sense of ordinary life in wider society, it would be a missed opportunity not to consider how societies and models of schooling could be reshaped, rather than assuming a return to what was there before. As barriers to operationalising aspects of safety, belonging and succeeding for all students are identified, the lenses of redistribution, recognition and representation shed light on the causes or sources of these barriers. Inevitably, localised experiences are shaped by national and global policy context. I called this talk Making Space for Refugee Education, and I'd like to argue that there are three routes towards this. So the first route is in making space for policy, for explicit policy around refugee education. And I've just captured on the slide there some of the sentences from the conclusion in the book. The second route is making explicit space for talking about practice based on an asset-based pedagogy, an initial holistic assessment, multilingualism, placemaking, culturally responsive pedagogies, and to educate future citizens about the causes of forced migration, so that we can better understand how our actions now have consequences for those who live thousands of miles away. And the final route is making space for a reconceptualization of education for the public good, one that's based on moral responsibility, and that has a holistic future-focused model of education, rather than a series of interventions based on test-driven pedagogies and outcomes. 3 years on from the Guardian article in England, Amar has started his degree in medicine, whilst in Sweden, Noor is on a vocational training course for painting. They're able to continue experiencing safety, belonging and success, and they were helped by those practitioners who are committed to supporting them in their ambitions. We can and we should learn from them. I think in the work, what emerges is that teachers and school leaders are advocates for refugees, that they share policy memory and that they are committed to brave leadership and to make brave decisions. I'd like to end with a call to action to demand a more equitable set of principles to guide the ways in which societies are reconceptualized. Aiming for all children and members of society to experience feelings of safety, belonging and success seems like a good place to start, as the long-term economic and health effects of international lockdowns will be felt for generations to come. The alternative is a shift back to what was before, a vision of addressing inequality through models of social mobility based on a false notion of meritocracy, skewed towards those who have economic and social capital and resource to be able to succeed. Inevitably, refugees and those most disadvantaged feel this inequality most keenly. I'm asking for future social models to be underpinned by policies across all areas of governance which prioritise well-being for all. An education for well-being policy would require different measures of success for individuals, for schools, and ultimately for societies. School leaders would be required to evidence curriculum and pedagogies that prioritise moral and ethical equity. For refugee and asylum-seeking children, this would incorporate their rights to a high-quality inclusive education on a par with peers in their new communities, and a commitment by the state to providing lifelong learning and training. Measures of success would be predicated upon the numbers of people who felt that they were able to live lives they and others in society value. Writing in the post-war years, Hannah Arendt described writing the origins of totalitarianism against a background of both relentless optimism and relentless despair. The same can be said of our experiences now as we emerge from the pandemic. However, what dominates is the optimism of the young refugees and asylum seekers and the people working with them. For them, I urge all who strive for an inclusive and fair world to take action to ensure that we can shift from despair to hope for a more socially just, inclusive education where every child can feel safe, belong, and experience success. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you, Joe, for that amazing presentation and presented so eloquently. And what struck me was that, you know, the real importance of this work and the research, and that it is empirically based, but also that you've used two very sort of strong framings that use very elegantly to sort of inform the work and the development of the work.